I am particularly interested in and excited about, and I hope you all are as well. Robert Seasonwein, who spent much of his career as a Nazi hunter, and we'll hear what that meant, will be speaking, and because we are privileged with having his daughter Jody as a member of our community, she will be giving us the full introduction.
Thank you, Rabbi. My name is Jody Seasonwein. I'm a member of the board here at TBI. And some people were asking me, are you related to the person that's coming to talk to us? And if you didn't guess, yes, Robert Seasonwein is my dad. My father retired recently after a 45-year-long career as an attorney in various roles, both in the private sphere as well as for the government. And in the 1990s, he was a senior trial attorney for the Office of Special Investigations out of the Department of Justice, the so-called Nazi hunters. These were years that overlapped with my years in high school. And as we were just reminiscing over dinner this evening, I think the last time that I asked him to come give a talk to my people was when I was in high school, and he came to speak to my high school history class. And he reminded me this evening that one of the students piped up and said, "How do we know that the Holocaust actually happened?" And I think that's a really important question to remember, that students were asking that then, and it's important to provide those answers, not just then, but now, not just in the light of the shootings in Poway and in Pittsburgh 6 months ago, but also thinking about all the times that I know Rabbi Ruchi has been called to local schools to talk with students who have been caught defacing school property with swastikas and didn't know what they were actually doing and didn't know what these symbols meant. And so I think it's really important to have my father to come and give witness to the work that he did, and so that hopefully no one in the future will ask, how do we know that really happened? So I'd like to welcome up to the podium my father, Robert Seasonwein.
Dachau and Treblinka, Auschwitz, Mauthausen, Babi Yar, Bergen-Belsen. Hundreds, thousands, millions of mothers and fathers and children rising from the chimneys, millions, and also one by one, each one. Those words, written by Abba Eban, speak of the most terrible of the many terrible tragedies that have been suffered by the Jewish people. However, while Abba Eban's words are graphic, they are also abstract. Today is Yom HaShoah, the day of remembrance of the Holocaust, the Shoah, a catastrophe of such magnitude that it defies understanding, and has forever cast its shadow over all Jews, over all mankind. Good evening. I'm Robert Seasonwein. I actually should have said I'm Jody's dad. And from 1991 to 1997, I was a member of the Office of Special Investigations, sometimes known as the Nazi hunters, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. The Office of Special Investigations was created in 1979 as a unit within the Criminal Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. Its mission was to detect and investigate individuals who took part in state-sponsored acts committed in violation of public international law, such as crimes against humanity, on behalf of the Nazi government of Germany. The magnitude of the Holocaust was so great that it is difficult to intellectually get our heads around it. Every day we see, read, or hear of tragic deaths. Someone is killed in a car crash, someone is shot in a drug deal gone bad, a bus crashes, and many are injured or killed. These are terrible, and the families of the dead are devastated. But what of the millions of mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, who never saw their loved ones again because they were viciously murdered for the crime of being Jewish. The Holocaust, a word that has been appropriated to describe crimes of such magnitude that they cannot be understood. But there is really only one Holocaust, the Shoah. Of all the tragedies that have been visited on the Jewish people over the generations, the Shoah is the singular event that defines pure evil. I remember stories told by older men and women in quiet voices. The potential witness in Florida, who had immigrated to Brooklyn, New York after World War II, who told me that one day her son came home without the friend he usually played with after school. When she asked him where his friend, who was also Jewish, was, her son said that the friend's mother said that he could no longer play with him because his mother was a criminal and had numbers on her arm. The several hours that I spent talking with another potential witness, also in Florida, who told me his history in great detail and how he survived to come to the U.S. His wife, daughter, and grandson were in another room during the interview, but after I returned to Washington, his daughter wrote to me and asked if they could have a copy of the tape recording of her father's story. I generally recorded witness interviews, because she and the rest of her family had never heard his story as completely as he told it to me. Of course, I had a copy made and sent it to him. And of course, the bald-faced lies told by persecutors. They weren't in the SS. They were teachers or farmers or bakers or ran into the woods to get away from those awful Nazis who would kill them if they didn't participate in murder. All lies. We never interviewed persecutors unless we had documentary evidence of the participation in genocide and crimes against humanity. After they told their lies, we confronted them with documents that placed them at a specific time and place and often described the horrors to which they had participated. I particularly remember the trial testimony of a survivor of the Kovno Kaunas ghetto massacre known as the Grosse Aktion. On June 22nd, and this is quoting now from his trial testimony, on June 22nd, 1941, German troops invaded Kaunas. A curfew was imposed and Jews were confined to their homes. In July 1941, all Jews were forced to abandon their homes and move to a part of town where a ghetto was formed. A ghetto government was formed with a police force and a fire brigade. Later, the ghetto was enclosed with barbed wire. Jews were forced to work for the Germans and Lithuanians, but were poorly clothed and poorly fed. Random violence, including beatings and the shooting of Jews for sport, were regularly engaged in by the Lithuanian Einsatzkommando. Those were the guards. During mid-1941, hundreds of Jews, doctors, lawyers, intellectuals, and those who were perceived to be of no further use to the Lithuanians and Germans were systematically separated from the community and executed. On October 4th, the ghetto hospital, with patients trapped inside, was torched and burned to the ground. Finally, on October 8th, in what became known as the Grosse, or Big Action, over 9,000 people, mostly women, children, and elderly men, were marched out of the ghetto to a nearby fort and shot to death. Let me paraphrase the trial testimony of Abe Malnick, who was 14 years old at the time, not much older than my grandson. On October 7th, there were announcements in Yiddish, German, and Lithuanian that the entire ghetto must assemble in the central square at 6 o'clock the next morning. Anyone who didn't show up would be shot. Nobody knew what would happen, and we tried to be optimistic that nothing would happen. So at 6 the next morning, we all walked to Democracy Square. We were formed into columns, with each family group standing together, my mother and father, my brother, my father's brother, and his family. Also my aunt and my grandmother. My grandmother was an older lady. Probably now you wouldn't say old. She was 50. My aunt had a deformity on her back. My father and I were in the ghetto fire brigade, and we were in the first column. As soon as it became light, maybe 7 o'clock, this big German with a leather coat was facing us and began to sort left and right. He came to our five, my mother, father, aunt, and grandmother. And while we were still young and could work, he saw my grandmother and aunt and told us to go left. We didn't know what would happen, but my mother had a feeling that something is bad. When the German told us to go left, the Lithuanians with guns started pushing us. We tried to go out, but they wouldn't let us. My mother said to my father, "Please go out, help yourself. Maybe you can rescue us." And he didn't want to go, but she pushed him out. My father had a fire brigade armband on, and the Lithuanians didn't know if he was a fireman or a policeman, so they let him go. He mixed in with the ghetto police, and we were pushed into the small ghetto. My mother grabbed me away because, sorry. I rushed to a guard and told him to let us go, that my father was in the fire brigade. However, he hit me in the face with a rifle butt. I said, "You're making a mistake, you need to let us go." He hit me again. My mother grabbed me away because I was full of blood, but I ran back to him again. And I said, "You make a mistake, my mother and I are young," so he hit me again. He knocked me down and stepped on my chest with his heel and started banging me in the face with his gun. His iron heel cut my leg completely open, and I could see the bones sticking out from the leg. My mother became hysterical and tried to save me, so he knocked her down, and then he let us both lay and walk away. I know that's our end. We can't go on. The whole family was there. We went into the house closest to the fence, but I didn't like it. I said, "Let's get away from the fence." I don't know why they listened to me, but we kept moving further and further to the back. It was the middle of the day, and in 3 hours, we were at the end of the ghetto. It gets darker and darker. I don't know what time it is. It was probably 10 or 11, and they start shooting. The Lithuanian bastards start shooting, like a barrage of fire over us that we shouldn't escape. The sky was red with gunshots and bullets falling all over. Then they started taking people out of the houses, taking out columns, 100 at a time, and marching them to the 9th fort, which was up the hill. When they came to us, it was already 10, 11 o'clock the next day. They started screaming and banging us with gun butts. We should go out and stay in columns. We started walking very slowly. We were in the last 100 of 10,000 people, give or take a few. A German officer came by and saw a lady and pulled her out. She had worked for him in Berlin or someplace. She fainted and in the excitement left her baby. She came by herself. My father happened to be there, hoping to see us, going by and rescue us. My father fell on the ground in front of the Germans and started begging. He said, "I am a fireman, I'm helping people." Next to him was the chief of the ghetto police, and he said, "Yes, he is a good man, please help him get his family out." The German says, "That all you got over there?" Knowing that because of my grandmother and aunt, we end up in the ghetto to be killed, my father says, "That's all I got, my wife and my son." So he says, "Let's go." Because we're in the last 100, I know I got an angel over my head. My grandmother and my whole family and the principal from the school and teachers, I see everybody right in front of me. And we hear the machine guns. We didn't believe it. A massacre of 10,000 people is happening right there. 12 members of my family walked up that road that day, and I never saw them again. In 1944, the Russian front moved closer, and the Germans and Lithuanians were killing more Jews who remained in the ghetto. I was put on a train, and at Stutthof, I was separated from my mother, and that was the last time I saw her. They took my father and me to Dachau, and then to Flossenburg, and then to Theresienstadt. We were liberated on the 8th of May. At the time, I was 17 and a half years old, and I weighed 75 pounds. I could hardly walk, but the Russians gave us some food. In a few weeks, I looked like a human being, and they gave me a gun and said, "Go find Germans and kill them." We lived in a neighborhood where there were Gentiles, there were Gentile customers, there were Gentile employees in my family's business, and here, all of a sudden, they killed us. I still at that moment can't understand how a human being can kill one another. This is my story. This is my experience, and whoever killed Jews, let them live with that until then. Let the guilt kill them. That's all I can say. This was a trial testimony in the case of Jonas Stelmokas, who was the guard commander of the Kovno ghetto at the time of the Grosse Massacre, and I actually prosecuted him in Philadelphia. As a former prosecutor at OSI, I must say that more than the victories in court, meeting the survivors was the ultimate reward. Their prosaic appearance and good nature belies the reality that they have known horror that the rest of us can only try to imagine. Many of them, like the young boy in the Kovno ghetto, witnessed the unspeakable through the eyes of terrified children. It was the experience of meeting these people that caused us to redouble our efforts to bring to justice the criminals who carried out Adolf Hitler's malignant vision. And believe me, the work was not without its frustrations. The outrageous lies of the defendants, the delaying tactics of their lawyers, the insensitivity of too many judges, and the deep-seated feelings that were brought to the fore when we asked the survivors to rip open their old wounds, to witness them weep for lost parents, lost brothers and sisters, and worst of all, their lost children. Through all of this, after 6 years as a prosecutor at OSI, I must tell you that I've gained little insight into the mentality that allowed human beings to perpetrate such evil. Indeed, although I have sat face to face with men who as much as admitted that they participated in mass murder, I am unable to understand how they could allow children to be killed. And how can we ever understand, let alone explain, that this crime was repeated over and over until over 1 million Jewish children lay dead? From April 14th to May 16th, 1943, 700 poorly armed Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto held off a well-trained, well-equipped German force dedicated to destroy them. Although hunger and sickness weakened them, again and again the Jewish defenders outmaneuvered their would-be killers until the Nazis resorted to setting the ghetto on fire. Block after block was torched in order to end the resistance. This was the single largest organized resistance by the oppressed to their oppressors. We remember the Warsaw Ghetto fighters and also the heroes of all Jewish uprising in the ghettos, forests, and camps of Nazi-occupied Europe, who signaled the return of the Jewish people to their biblical tradition as great and courageous fighters. We also remember the Danes and others elsewhere in Europe who risked and sometimes gave their lives in order to save Jews. Those examples remind us of how much more could have been done had not the overwhelming majority of Europeans looked the other way while their friends and neighbors were rounded up and delivered to the execution pits and gas chambers. Had the people of Germany put up even 1/100th as much resistance as the emaciated Jews of Warsaw, there would not have been a Holocaust. Similarly, while we rightly pay tribute to the valiant Allied soldiers who liberated the camps, we know that the Allied governments, including the United States, could have acted to bring the machinery of annihilation to a halt much earlier. Instead, the Allies did not see fit to use the powerful BBC transmitters to broadcast a warning in 1944 to the nearly 500,000 Hungarian Jews awaiting so-called resettlement to Poland, a warning that would have told them that their destination was Auschwitz and certain death. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and many other Holocaust memorials in the United States and around the world stand as eternal memorials to those who perished and as a warning to the world about what can happen when evil is unchallenged. I believe that the experience of victimization, especially in the genocidal maelstrom of the Holocaust, has made the Jewish people into something of a societal canary in the coal mine. Much as it has fallen to us to be the world's collective memory of all the crimes of the Nazis, the imperatives never forget and never again have led Jews to continue to place themselves at the forefront of those who denounce injustice. But we Jews have also learned that a key lesson of the Holocaust is that one must not wait until those who harbor genocidal ambitions are able to actually realize their pernicious dreams. They must be stopped before they build the ghettos, the mobile gas vans, the ovens, and the cremation pits. We Jews know that there is not one merchant of hatred who is so powerful or devoid of support that society can afford to ignore him. There is another lesson we learned from our experience with Corporal Hitler. We also view with alarm the continuing manifestations of anti-Semitism in Europe. Some of these outrages are taking place in countries in which virtually all Jews were murdered half a century ago. the eruption of violence, most especially in Poland, Hungary, Austria, and sadly right here in the United States, in Poway, Pittsburgh, Charlottesville, makes us wonder how much has really changed since the days of the jackbooted stormtroopers in the Gestapo. As we think of our 6 million Kedoshim, we are saddened beyond the ability of words to express. But let it also be said, however politically incorrect it may be, that we, the remnant of the Jewish people, are angry, and our angry is beyond the ability of words to express. We'll always be angry. Yes, we say to Germany and the nations of Europe that have collaborated in murdering our grandparents and our aunts and uncles and our parents and even our littlest children, we remember what you've done. We will always remember what you have done, and we will force the world to remember what you have done. We may forgive, but we cannot forget. The history of OSI has been written, and in some small way will help tell the world the story of the Shoah. As I conclude this evening, I'm reminded that when the great Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov saw misfortune threatening the Jews, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest to meditate. And there he would light a fire and say a special prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune averted. Later, when his disciple, the celebrated Maggid of Mezrish, had occasion, for the same reason, to intercede with heaven, he would go into the same place in the forest and say, Master of the universe, listen, I do not know how to light the fire, but I am still able to say the prayer. And again, the miracle would be accomplished. Still later, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sassov, in order to save his people once more, would go into the forest and say, I do not know how to light the fire. I do not know the prayer, but I know the place, and this must be sufficient. It was sufficient, and the miracle was accomplished. Then it fell to Rabbi Israel of Ryzen to overcome misfortune. Sitting in his armchair, his head in his hands, he spoke to God. I am unable to light the fire. I do not know the prayer. I cannot even find the place in the forest. All I can do is tell the story, and this must be sufficient. And it was sufficient. God made man because he loves stories. It is our responsibility, each and every one of us, to tell the story of the Shoah. Thank you very much this evening. Shalom. Yes.
My question is, the people that you prosecuted, what happened? What was the result?
These were people who had come to the United States illegally. They had lied. Actually, it wasn't until, I think, 1952 that Germans could even immigrate to the United States because there was a prohibition against that right after the war. So OSI's cases were sort of between a criminal and a civil case. The standard of proof was not beyond a reasonable doubt, but by clear and convincing evidence which leaves no issue in doubt, which is essentially the same thing with more words. But because we were never able to prove that they had committed crimes against United States citizens, the best that we did was we would take away their citizenship if they had become naturalized, and we would get an order of deportation. I don't even remember the number now, got orders of deportation and had people removed from the United States in a number of cases. A number of other defendants choose to flee the United States before a case could be brought against them. The Germans and most other countries in Europe initially were not interested in prosecuting these people. We didn't get a lot of assistance. Incidentally, it's very strange, but most of the documentary evidence that we received came from files that were in the possession of the Russians, the Soviets, and they had captured a lot of Nazi records after the war and basically had transported them into the Soviet Union. And at OSI, we had prosecutors, we also had investigators, but we also, and most importantly, had a lot of PhD historians. And the historians really were the linchpin for most of our cases. They would go out and collect documentary evidence. Initially, they went to the Soviet Union, to Russia, and went to these files, which hadn't been touched. There were no finding aids for those of you who do research in archives. They basically would have to go through files to look for whatever they were looking for. But the fascinating thing about this, and it's sort of a stereotype that Germans are very orderly and very obsessive about keeping records. Yeah, they were anyway, and these records generally were quite detailed, and they were all in order. So you'd have order number 1, order number 2, and they were all in separate folders. And anyway, the short answer to the question is that we would take away their citizenship, throw them out of the country. There was a law that was passed that changed the Social Security laws back in the 90s, that because if you think about it, if someone had retired and was collecting Social Security, it didn't make any difference where they were living. However, if they were convicted of having participated in crimes against humanity, their Social Security was cut off. So they weren't going to have a very pleasant life. I think for most of us, the fact that these people were exposed was a good start. Some of these people had lived in their communities for many, many years, as became kindly old men, who gave candy to the kids or whatever. This particular case that I quoted from, Jonas Stelmokas, came to the United States and got an architecture degree at University of Pennsylvania and practiced architecture for many years. So they sort of came here, they lied, they sort of blended into the community, and then of course they were removed and didn't have their comfortable life anymore. It's a pretty long answer to your question. But.
Okay. Thank you very much for your comments and the work that you did back. Can everybody hear? It's not a question, but I wanted to mention that today an Oregon legislature had its final hearing for legislation that will be mandating genocide and hate education in all high schools in Oregon. And it is, I think, 100% sure that it will pass. And our state will join others that are mandating that education. So appropriately, today was the final hearing of that bill.
Well, I certainly hope it passes.
I don't think there's a question that it will pass. So.
And it is on the curriculum in many other states. In fact, I had gone with one of our historians to a training session for teachers in Maryland a number of years ago.
Thank you so much. I'm curious if in your years of doing this work you noticed any trends about why these people had chosen to come to the United States, and you mentioned Jonas Stelmokas becoming an architect, but was there any repentance? I mean, was there any sense that they were trying to create a completely different life than what they had done, or just what you felt you learned from that?
That's a very complex question. I'll start with the first part of it. The United States actually facilitated some of their coming here. After the Second World War, the United States competed with the Soviet Union, particularly for scientists, rocket scientists. Obviously the Germans had been building rockets, the V-1 and the V-2, and after the war, there was a race to see how many of these scientists could come to the United States versus the Soviet Union. Wernher von Braun actually ended up here, the father of the Saturn rocket. I mean, for those of us of a certain age. I remember watching Wide World of Disney with Werner von Braun in his white coat and his pointer pointing at the Saturn rocket. I don't know that and he actually got a presidential medal. I don't know that we would have gone after von Braun. Von Braun died before the office really came into being. We did go after a couple of other people who have been involved in the V-2 rocket program. And most of these people weren't scientists, don't get me wrong. I mean, Samokas wasn't a scientist, none of these other people were scientists. But what happened was they were hangers-on. There were people who sort of wormed their way into being able to come to the United States. And sadly, the government was complicit in helping just some of the ordinary men, as they were known, to come to the United States. Some immigration people got to know some of these folks, and I actually have heard testimony from people saying, you can't come now, but come back in 2 weeks because the law is going to change and you'll be able to come here. I mean, it defies logic. I don't understand it. As far as their lives here, most of them didn't change their names, interestingly. Many of them lived in ethnic communities in places like Chicago, where I did some investigations in the south side of Chicago, where people could speak Polish or Lithuanian or Latvian and never really learn much English and still get around. And most of them, they worked as bakers, or they worked in laborers' jobs. I think it was sort of unusual in a way to see someone who would get an advanced degree and practice a profession. But, as I said, I think that there was a movie that was made a number of years ago called now I'm blocking on it. It was about the Music Box, the Music Box. Which was a story about an older man who was Hungarian and had come to the United States, and was sort of interesting. The Chicago office of OSI in the movie went to investigate him. There was no Chicago office of OSI. Our office was always in Washington. But they went to investigate him, and his daughter was a lawyer, or his granddaughter was a lawyer, I guess, and she was defending him. And at the end, it turned out that he had been a publicist for the Arrow Cross in Hungary. It was a movie that was written and filmed by Joe Esterhazy. Joe Esterhazy was a pretty well-known filmmaker a number of years ago. He was asked a number of times whether this was sort of biographical of someone, and he always denied it, but in fact we knew it was his father. He lived in a community, just, blended in. So anyway, that's, I think that people were willing to accept immigrants to the United States, unlike some people now. I'm not going to get political. They welcomed people as long as they, fit into the community. So, people, we would interview people, and we did what we call drop-in interviews, which basically meant that we would go to, say, Chicago. We would spend 3-4 days in Chicago, maybe a week, and have a list of people we wanted to talk with, basically knock on their door, identify ourselves. We never tried to trick them, and say we wanted to ask them some questions. And we'd also tell them that if at any time they wanted to stop the interview or didn't want to talk with us or wanted to retain a lawyer, they were free to do that. And many of them talked with us, and they would tell a story. And when confronted with evidence, we have documents that say on such and such a date you were here, they would deny it. The final thing that you asked, and I've never heard any participant in persecution express remorse. To the contrary, when finally confronted and acknowledging that they did whatever they were accused of doing, they would basically say, what could I do? If I didn't do that, I would be shot. And there was no evidence. In fact, again, I don't remember, there's a book that was written about a killing unit of, I believe, Lithuanians, and people would claim that if they didn't carry out orders that they would be shot or they would somehow be eliminated, and there's never been any evidence that that actually happened. In fact, there was evidence to the contrary.
Oh, thank you very much for your presentation. I kind of hesitate to say that because there was one moment that you said we can forgive, but we must not forget. And that is quite similar to what the president of Brazil recently said in a talk too. He said about, the Holocaust, and well, we can even forgive, but we must not forget. So I was a bit taken by that, because in his case, well, he's a Christian, and the idea of forgiveness is different. It's somewhat gratuitous, and it does, some good to the person who forgives. But in Judaism, there is, in the idea of forgiveness, it's implied also the concept of reparation. There must be some reparation and something that would correct the error, the action for which, one is forgiving. And then I wonder, can it be forgiven? I mean, is there a way of repairing? Can it ever be corrected? And I know what I think, but so I'm just, kind of calling into question that point.
Let me clarify my statement, okay? When I say forgive, when I was young, I once bought something and it said made in West Germany, and someone said, how could you buy that? It was made in Germany. I said, but it's West Germany. They said, I don't care what Germany it was, it's Germany. When I say forgive, I'm talking about people who are Germans now. In fact, Germany is probably one of Israel's better allies. When I say forgive, it's sort of not holding the sins of the father, or more likely the grandfather, against the son or the grandson. Not forgiving the people who committed these atrocities. They can never be forgiven. I would say that virtually all of them are dead now, but I would never forgive any of them, and I never forgave any of the people I prosecuted. But by the same token, I can't hold it against the people who live in Germany. I was going to say Poland and Hungary, but they've sort of reverted to form now. I mean, I've been in both of those countries over the years, and I can't really forgive them for what they're doing now. But there are lots of people, and I'm not going to say there are good people on both sides, but there are lots of people who had no part in the Holocaust. They weren't born during the Holocaust, and they may even be children of people who weren't born in the Holocaust. And I really, unless they exhibit some behavior that would cause me to say, that's really beyond the pale, I really can't hold the Holocaust against them. By the same token, they need to be educated what their relatives did.
So, a quick story. I had the honor and privilege of spending a week in Auschwitz from spring of 1980 with a group of 30 young Germans. And in the process of listening to some former inmates who stayed in that area solely for the purpose of telling their stories, we got to hear, the stories of the survivors. Incredibly powerful experience. And I'll just never forget from those young Germans of their kind of testament that we're not responsible for the sins of our parents, but we are responsible as Germans to see to it that it never happens again. And this particular organization, that was its whole purpose, to engage in signs of atonement for the sins of Germany. But I want to turn that around, as you, particularly in your reference to the one story of what our country did not do. And so what is our responsibility? You know, we're not responsible for the sins of our parents, but what is our responsibility as we carry this forward, and particularly as we think about the lost generation that, it will be within many of our lifetimes that we will see the last survivor of the Shoah, and there will no longer be those kind of personal stories that you relied upon. So say a little bit more in terms of our responsibility.
Well, for those of you who have been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, they address that quite openly, the refusal to bomb Auschwitz, to bomb the rail lines going to Auschwitz. There are letters from the State Department, a book that some of you probably read in the Garden of Beasts a number of years ago. I'm not responsible for every agency of the federal government, but frankly, the State Department was sort of a hotbed of, I'll say disinterest. I won't say that they necessarily were anti-Semitic, although I think a lot of them probably were. But the State Department in the 30s, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s was really sort of a white shoe Gentile establishment. Well, even some of the Jewish advisors to Roosevelt dissuaded him from taking steps. Well, Roosevelt didn't want to enter the Second World War initially. I mean, he was trying to push it off as much as he could, and it wasn't until Pearl Harbor that we ever really got involved. But, I think at the time there was a sentiment that I know some of Roosevelt's Jewish advisors basically said, don't press Hitler because it'll make it a lot worse. I'm not sure it could have gotten much worse. But I mean, it's a fact. We could have done more, and we could have done it sooner, and we didn't. So, I don't know how or if ever the government will own up to that. By the way, a week at Auschwitz sounds like a real experience.
Thank you very much. What was the impetus for creating OSI? Why did that happen? Who made that happen? Who were the people that started that program initially?
Initially, there was an office called the Special Investigations Unit of the Immigration Service, and they were charged with finding people, and this was in probably the early 70s, and they were charged with finding people who had illegally entered the country after the Second World War, who had participated in crimes against humanity. They were understaffed, they didn't have a lot of resources, and they were remarkably unsuccessful. They didn't win any cases. They only brought, I believe, 6 cases, and didn't win any of them. Then Representative Elizabeth Holtzman from New York sponsored legislation to create an office within the criminal division of the Justice Department. The criminal division because the criminal division lawyers were thought to be the best prosecutors available. I would go along with that, but disinterested, But she also provided resources for the office. So, as I said before, in its prime, the Office of Special Investigations had lots of very experienced prosecutors, a number of investigators, and a number of PhD historians. And The first director of the office was a gentleman by the name of Walter Rockler, who, as a young attorney, had been a Nuremberg prosecutor, a very young Nuremberg prosecutor on the bankers case. He was with a law firm in town, and they persuaded him to become the first director. After Walter was a director, in an attempt to sort of not give the impression that this was a Jewish office, a non-Jew by the name of Ryan, and I'm blocking on his last name right now. Anyway, he's at Harvard now, but became the director, then Neil Scher. Anyway, the office was really ramped up, and also, as I said, even though the United States' formal relationship with the Soviet Union didn't come for a number of years after that, and this was in 1987 that the unit was formed, right? 87. It was earlier. It was 78. 78 was the Holtzman Amendment, you know, it really it became obvious that we needed to have access to records, and even though the United States didn't have formal diplomatic relationship with the Sovs, you know, in a cooperative relationship, the office historians actually formed a relationship with their counterparts in Russia, and that's how they were able to get into the archives that had these records. You know, the most frequently asked questions among that was, you know, how many of these people came into the country? It's not really clear, but when I left, I believe that there were something in the vicinity of about 200 cases that had resulted in convictions, and the people had either been naturalized or deported from the country. So it started in the 70s. It got very active at that time. There were three cases that actually went to the Supreme Court over the history of OSI, then it started to slow down, probably in you know, the late 90s, because most of these folks were pretty old, they were dying, they were leaving the country. The office doesn't exist anymore, not as a separate office. It was incorporated into a different office in the criminal division. It's, I think, the National Security Division now. So there was a recognition that most of the potential subjects really weren't available anymore.
I think we'll take two more questions.
Two more? Okay.
Is that all
Someone
right?
in the back and someone over here?
So I know, is this working? I know that you talked about how the U.S. was complicit in bringing Germans into this country directly after the war. But can you talk about, if you have any ideas, why it took 25 years to get to the point of, and do you think, I'm sure it must have had something to do with kind of letting that knowledge die down or go away. But would have there been other reasons why it took so long to get anything going?
Not the first person to ask that question. I was just telling my daughter this evening when we were eating dinner, I said that you know, a number of survivors back in the 90s even were saying, you know, you're too late. How come you weren't here 20 years ago? I think that, well, let's put it this way. I mean, I'm a baby boomer. I was in the first generation of baby boomers. And I think I never really heard much about the Holocaust. Oh, boy. I mean, well, first of all, the Holocaust itself is a term that was coined by Elie Wiesel. But back in the day, and I grew up in Brooklyn, where you would think that if any community was going to talk about the Holocaust, it probably would have been in New York. It didn't happen. I mean, I can't remember the first time that I really had heard of the Holocaust. So I think that it was sort of something that was sort of shoved to the back, you know. People didn't want to talk about it. And I think there probably was some embarrassment on the part of the government for not entering the war sooner, for not doing things to protect the victims. As I said, you know, if you go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, you can see the letters that were written by the State Department basically saying, oh, well, our planes don't have the range to bomb the railroad tracks going into Auschwitz, which was not true. That you know, many more people would die, which was not true. You know, I think it probably took about 20 years for this to become something that was important. So, but we did the best we could. Last one. You get the last word.
I want to, first of all, thank you for the years of work that you did. So I've done a lot of research over the years. Both of my sides of my family were murdered by the Einsatzgruppen, and both of my parents ended up in Auschwitz. And I'm wondering if you are aware of the Seasonwein case. It was the one war crimes trial that happened in England, and he was a Nazi collaborator from my father's town of Dept, which is now in Belarus, who was hiding out as a London ticket taker. And they actually brought the witnesses and the jury to Dept to show where everything happened. And he died in jail, in prison in England. And I'm wondering if there was any collaboration with the British government.
I'm not familiar with the case. I can tell you that our office did cooperate with Canada, with Great Britain, even to some extent with archives within Germany, with the Berlin Document Center. However, most of the countries where these subjects came from refused to cooperate with us. We got nothing from Lithuania for quite a while, until actually the dissolution of the Soviet Union, you know, when the Iron Curtain countries just sort of, you know, went their own way. In fact, I actually was responsible for the first deportation of someone to Lithuania, a fellow by the name of Menakis, who I found down in Florida. It was fascinating to me, by the way, for those of you who have family who have relocated to Florida. You know, the east coast of Florida has a reputation of being just like New York, only transplanted south. But it's amazing how many of these people also ended up in Florida. But in any event, we didn't get a lot of cooperation. But with the Brits and the Canadians did a lot of investigations. Their burden of proof was a little bit different than ours, and for quite a while they were not real successful. However, we did collaborate with them, and I think they did get some convictions. In any event, well, good for the British prosecutors for sticking someone in prison. I thank you very much.
So,
I'll answer your question later.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here tonight.